December 1960. New York City. The Plaza Hotel. Truman Capote sits across from Paramount executives, smoking a cigarette, listening to news that will change everything. They've just told him who they want to cast as Holly Golightly in the film adaptation of his novella, Breakfast at Tiffany's. Audrey Hepburn. Capote takes a long drag from his cigarette, stares at them. His response is immediate and devastating. Audrey Hepburn? She's completely wrong for Holly. Holly is supposed to be a tough little cookie from the South. Audrey is refined, European. She's the opposite of everything I wrote. The executives try to explain. Audrey's box office appeal, her elegance, her ability to make any character sympathetic. Capote interrupts. You don't understand. You're not adapting my story. You're creating something entirely different and calling it Breakfast at Tiffany's. This is the beginning of one of Hollywood's most complicated author-adaptation relationships. Truman Capote versus Audrey Hepburn, the brilliant, acerbic writer who created Holly Golightly versus the elegant actress chosen to embody her. A 5-year battle over the soul of a character, and the surprising ending that nobody saw coming. This is the real story of Truman Capote's reaction to Audrey Hepburn's casting. What he actually said. How he fought against it. Why he eventually changed his mind, and the admission that shocked everyone who knew him. To understand Capote's horror at Audrey's casting, you need to understand who he envisioned as Holly Golightly. Not just physically, but psychologically. Holly wasn't meant to be likable. She wasn't meant to be someone you'd want to marry or save. She was meant to be dangerous, unpredictable, a beautiful disaster who used her sexuality as a weapon. Capote wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's in 1958. It was semi-autobiographical, based on women he'd known in New York. Call girls, party girls. Women who lived by their wits and their beauty. Holly was composite of the most fascinating and dangerous women in his social circle. Holly represents a particular kind of New York girl, Capote explained in interviews. She's tough as nails underneath all that charm. She'll break your heart not because she means to, but because she can't help it. That's her nature. When Paramount bought the rights to Breakfast at Tiffany's, Capote assumed they understood his vision. Holly was immoral, sexually adventurous, probably a prostitute, though Capote never stated it explicitly. She wasn't a heroine, she was an anti-heroine. But Hollywood in 1960 didn't make movies about anti-heroines, especially not movies starring major female stars. The production code was still in effect. Prostitution couldn't be depicted sympathetically. Sexual promiscuity had to be punished. Characters had to be redeemable. Paramount's solution? Cast someone so inherently sympathetic that audiences would love Holly despite her flaws. Someone whose natural grace would soften Holly's edges. Someone like Audrey Hepburn. But first, they had to convince Truman Capote. The meeting at the Plaza Hotel was a disaster. Capote listened to their pitch for Audrey and became increasingly agitated. You want Audrey Hepburn? Fine, but don't pretend you're making my story. You're making a romantic comedy about a quirky girl who happens to be named Holly Golightly. Producer Richard Shepard tried to reassure him. Truman, we understand your concerns. But Audrey can bring depth to Holly. She can show the vulnerability underneath the surface. Holly doesn't have vulnerability underneath, Capote snapped. She has emptiness underneath. That's what makes her fascinating and tragic. If you make her vulnerable, you make her safe. And safe is not Holly Golightly. Capote had someone else in mind for Holly, someone he'd campaigned for since the moment Paramount bought the rights. Marilyn Monroe. To Capote, Monroe was perfect for Holly. She had the sexuality, the danger, the ability to break men's hearts while seeming innocent. She was complex in ways that matched Holly's complexity. Marilyn understands damaged women, Capote told friends. Because she is one, she could play Holly without sentimentality, without making her cute. Capote had approached Monroe directly, sent her the novella, asked her to lobby for the role. Monroe was interested, very interested. She saw Holly as a chance to show her dramatic range, to prove she was more than just a sex symbol. But Monroe came with complications. Her recent films had been troubled productions. She was difficult to work with, unreliable. Studio executives were nervous about betting a major production on her unpredictability. Audrey, by contrast, was professional perfection, always on time, always prepared, always a pleasure to work with. Insurance companies loved her, studios trusted her, audiences adored her. From a business perspective, Audrey was the obvious choice. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. If you think so too, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. From an artistic perspective, Capote believed she was catastrophically wrong. The battle went public in early 1961. Capote gave interviews expressing his displeasure with the casting. Not personal attacks on Audrey, he was too sophisticated for that, but pointed criticisms of the choice. Miss Hepburn is a lovely actress, he told the New York Times. But she's not Holly. Holly is a wild thing. Miss Hepburn is a tame thing. That's not a criticism of her talent. It's a recognition that some roles require specific qualities. The interview appeared on February 14th, 1961. Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on Hollywood insiders. Capote was publicly breaking up with Audrey before their artistic relationship had even begun. Audrey, reading these interviews, was hurt but tried to understand. She respected Capote's work, knew he had every right to object to her casting, but she also believed she could find something truthful in Holly, something authentic that went beyond Capote's initial conception. I understand why Mr. Capote might have reservations, Audrey told reporters diplomatically. I can only promise to work very hard to honor his creation while bringing my own understanding to the role. Her response impressed industry insiders. Instead of fighting back or dismissing Capote's concerns, she acknowledged them with grace and professionalism. It was vintage Audrey, taking the high road even when personally attacked. Behind the scenes, director Blake Edwards was trying to navigate between Capote's artistic vision and Paramount's commercial needs. Edwards understood both perspectives. Holly needed to be complex and edgy enough to be interesting, but also sympathetic enough for a mainstream audience. We're not making an art film, Edwards told Capote during a heated phone conversation. We're making a movie that people will pay to see. Audrey gives us the best chance of success. Success at what cost? Capote replied. You're gutting my story. We're adapting your story. There's a difference. Not much of one. As pre-production continued, Capote's objections became more specific. He hated the script changes that made Holly more sympathetic. Hated the decision to give her a clear redemptive arc. Hated the softening of her relationship with Paul. Most of all, he hated how Audrey's natural elegance was affecting the character conception. They're turning Holly into a princess, he complained to friends. A lost princess who needs to be saved by love. That's not who I wrote. I wrote a survivor who saves herself by any means necessary. The changes weren't subtle. In Capote's novella, Holly is clearly a call girl. In the film script, she's an escort who goes to parties for money. The sexual implications were sanitized for mainstream audiences. In the novella, Holly abandons the narrator without explanation at the end. In the film, she has a romantic reconciliation with Paul. Love conquers all, instead of love being impossible. They've taken my realistic portrait of a damaged woman and turned it into a fairy tale, Capote told Harper's Bazaar. That's not adaptation. That's appropriation. Filming began in October 1961. Capote was not invited to the set. Paramount executives made it clear his presence would not be welcome. They were tired of his complaints, tired of his interference. So Capote waited and worried, and gave increasingly bitter interviews about what Hollywood was doing to his work. They bought my book for the title and the basic situation, he told Esquire magazine. Everything else, the character, the psychology, the point, they've changed beyond recognition. But then something unexpected happened. Capote saw the dailies. Blake Edwards, trying to maintain some relationship with the author, invited Capote to a private screening of early footage. Capote agreed, expecting to hate what he saw. Instead, he was surprised. Audrey is doing something I didn't expect, he told Edwards after the screening. She's not trying to be tough like Holly. She's being fragile. But there's strength in her fragility. It's interesting. It wasn't what Capote had envisioned, but it wasn't without merit. The footage showed Audrey bringing qualities to Holly that weren't in the script. A wounded quality. A sense that this woman had been hurt and was protecting herself through performance. It was more psychologically complex than Capote had anticipated. Over the next few weeks, Edwards showed Capote more footage. Gradually, Capote's opinion began to shift. Not completely. He still believed Marilyn Monroe would have been more faithful to his original conception. But he started to see what Audrey was bringing to Holly. She's playing a different character, Capote admitted. Not my Holly, but a valid interpretation of someone who could be named Holly Golightly. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support means everything to us. The transformation in Capote's attitude accelerated when he saw Audrey's performance in the dramatic scenes. Particularly the scene where Holly talks about her brother Fred. The scene where she visits Sally Tomato in prison. The scene where she receives news of her brother's death. In those moments, Capote later said, Audrey found something I hadn't written. A kind of desperate hope masquerading as sophistication. It wasn't my Holly, but it was truthful in its own way. But Capote's real revelation came during the film's emotional climax. The scene in the taxi where Holly decides to abandon Kat rather than take responsibility for him, where she chooses freedom over love. In Capote's novella, this moment reveals Holly's fundamental selfishness. She's incapable of real love, incapable of commitment. It's a devastating character revelation. In the film, Audrey plays it differently. Holly isn't selfish in this moment. She's terrified. Terrified of being hurt. Terrified of losing someone else she loves. The abandonment of Kat isn't cruel. It's self-protective. Audrey found the fear behind Holly's coldness, Capote told a friend after seeing this scene. I wrote Holly as someone who couldn't love. Audrey is playing her as someone who's afraid to love. That's actually more interesting. The film premiered in October 1961. Capote attended reluctantly, expecting to hate the finished product. He didn't hate it. "It's not my story," he told reporters after the premiere. "But it's a good story. And Audrey is luminous in it." This was the beginning of Capote's public rehabilitation of his opinion about Audrey's casting. The premiere was at Radio City Music Hall. Capote wore a white dinner jacket and bow tie. Audrey wore Givenchy black. They posed for photographers together, both smiling diplomatically. The tension between them had softened considerably since December 1960. Over the next few months, as Breakfast at Tiffany's became a massive success, Capote's comments about Audrey grew increasingly positive. "I was wrong to object so strenuously to her casting," he admitted in a 1962 interview. "I was protecting my original vision so fiercely that I couldn't see what she might bring to it." But Capote's most surprising comment came in a 1965 interview with the Paris Review. Asked about the film adaptation of his work, Capote said something that shocked everyone who knew about his initial opposition. "Audrey Hepburn is the only actress who could have made that version of Holly Golightly work. I wanted Marilyn, because Marilyn could have played my Holly. But Audrey created a different Holly, one that's equally valid and perhaps more lasting." This wasn't grudging acceptance. This was genuine admiration. But Capote's ultimate admission came in 1975, during a television interview with David Suskind. Asked about his regrets in Hollywood, Capote gave an answer that stunned viewers. "My biggest regret is how I behaved during Breakfast at Tiffany's. I was so concerned with protecting my original conception that I couldn't appreciate what Audrey was creating. She gave Holly a soul I hadn't written, made her someone you could love without losing respect for her intelligence." "Do you wish you'd supported her from the beginning?" Suskind asked. "Yes," Capote said without hesitation. "Audrey deserved better from me. She was trying to honor my work while creating something new. That takes courage. I should have recognized it." When Audrey saw this interview years later, she was moved to tears. "I never expected him to change his mind," she told friends. "I always assumed he tolerated the film at best." The relationship between Capote and Audrey became genuinely warm in later years. They would see each other at parties, exchange letters, share mutual respect. Capote would often tell people that Audrey's Holly Golightly was his favorite film adaptation of his work. "She saved the character from my own limitations," he said in one of his final interviews. "I wrote Holly as someone who couldn't grow. Audrey played her as someone who was learning to grow. That's more hopeful, maybe more honest." When Audrey died in 1993, Capote had been dead for 9 years, but friends remembered what he'd said about her in his later years. "Audrey Hepburn taught me that there's more than one way to be truthful about a character. My way wasn't the only way. Maybe it wasn't even the best way." This is the real story of Truman Capote and Audrey Hepburn. Not the simple narrative of author versus adaptation, but the complex story of an artist learning to appreciate an interpretation he hadn't anticipated. Capote started by hating Audrey's casting, ended by calling it inspired, started by fighting against her vision of Holly, ended by admitting her vision was more complete than his own. It took him 5 years to admit he was wrong. But when he did, his admission was complete and generous. Audrey Hepburn didn't ruin Holly Golightly. Capote said in 1975. She completed her. That's the journey. From rejection to acceptance to admiration. From she's wrong for the role to she's the only actress who could have played it. Sometimes the best adaptations aren't faithful to the original vision. They're faithful to the original spirit while finding new ways to express it. That's what Audrey did with Holly Golightly. And eventually, Truman Capote was grateful she did. This is Audrey Hepburn, The Hidden Truth. From wartime horrors to Hollywood secrets, we uncover what they've been hiding for decades. Subscribe to discover the dark truth behind the elegant image.